So what you see here is the original Nobel will, handwritten in Paris in 1895. And everything goes into this very short will. And it has been always the difficulties to understand how to interpret what was the intention of Alfred Nobel. Let's go to no, I have to go this way. To a translation to English. So it's one part of the prize, there should be 5 parts. One part to the person who shall have made the most important discovery or invention within the field of physics. In chemistry, it's a little bit different. The most important discovery or improvement. So the chemists, they don't have the possibility of invention. On the other hand, improvement is more loose, so to say. We have more strict in physics. And it has always been the problem for all Nobel committees to understand, okay, how important is the discovery or invention? Nobel Foundation, this is a private foundation that was established in 1900 to take care of Alfred Nobel's enormous fortune. He was extremely rich. And the Nobel Foundation has sort of the overall responsibility, but they have nothing to do with the selection of the Nobel Prize, because that's pointed out by Nobel here in the will, that the prizes in physics and chemistry should be awarded by the Swedish Academy of Sciences, which is now usually called the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. So they have the full responsibility for the prize, and the Nobel Foundation has nothing to do with how the prize is selected. So, private institution. And of course, it represents Nobel in all externally and administrative information activities and all the arrangement around the Nobel Prize, the celebrations as well. In physics and chemistry, as I mentioned, it's the Academy of Sciences. And I will go through a little bit how this is done in practice, but the first prize was awarded in 1901. So only 1 year after Nobel Foundation had been established and the Nobel statutes had been written down. And of course, physics got a flying start with Wilhelm Röntgen as the prize winner. And as I say, I don't know how you pronounce it. I know in Russian you say Röntgen. In Ukrainian, maybe
Röntgen.
Röntgen, yeah. In Swedish we say it Röntgen. Yeah. So the procedure is, we ask for nominations in September typically, and then those that are nominating, they have until late January 31st, or late is maybe February 1st, to send in their nomination letters. Then there is a selection going on, and finally in October there is the vote in the Academy in Pleno, taking a vote, and that's how you select the winner. I will come back a little bit to this. And then of course December 10th, the day that Alfred Nobel died, is when we have the award ceremony in Stockholm. Here is the Nobel Committee for 2013. You can see Nobel here in the background somewhere. Here. This was my first year in the Nobel Committee, so I was sort of a beginner here in this. And I'm standing here. This is a problem. It is working.
Yeah.
It is working, okay.
This
one, yes. So I'm here the beginner. Lars Brink was sort of the person who taught me what to do. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. You have here Anne Lullier, who 10 years later from this photo was taken. She was awarded a Nobel Prize in 2023 for her contribution to attosecond physics. And you may see that we are dressed very formally. This is not how we work. This is only for the camera. We put on the tie, a galstuk, and then we go to take a photo, and then we come back and continue to work, and we take it off.
In t-shirts.
So, the nominations. Nominations to the Nobel Prize is by invitation only. The names of the nominees and other information of the nominators or of nomination cannot be revealed until 50 years after the prize, or sometimes longer, and I will mention this. The Nobel Committee sends out these confidential forms to persons who are competent and qualified to nominate, and a person who is not nominated a particular year cannot be considered for the Nobel Prize. So you need at least one nomination. This is the rule. And you cannot be awarded the prize after you died. That's not possible. So who can nominate? There is a list of those that can nominate. If you're a Swedish or foreign member of the Academy, you can nominate. If you're a member of the Nobel Committee, they could be a member of the Nobel Committee, not member of the Academy. So, but usually it's the same. Nobel laureates in physics have a permanent right to nominate after they've been awarded. And then permanent and assistant professor in science or physics at the Nordic countries. And also Karolinska Institute for medicine. And then we consult experts at different universities. You can rotate so that different university will get a letter and asking for a nomination. And then we can also consult other scientists that we feel would be very interesting to hear their opinion. So the nominations are sent out, as I mentioned, in September. And then typically we send out 3,000 letters. And the response function is not that very high, actually. We get maybe 400 or 500 letters back with nominations. And deadline, I mentioned that. So we have typically something between 250 and 350 names that are listed as potential Nobel laureates. Then, between March and May, we make a consultation with experts. In the old days, these special reports that we asked for were only written by members of the Nobel Committee. But now, with how physics has expanded so much, it's not possible in a small group of 5, 6, 7 people to have an expertise in everything. So what we usually do is that we consult experts not really on the nominated, not frequently nominated for the prize, but we know that they are very knowledgeable. So we ask them for these confidential letters that will be kept for 50 years, and they are informed about this, which means that they can speak openly. This is very nice. It's a very different quality of this special report. But a very good written special report is very valuable. Oops. Then during the summer, June to August, we are writing a report from the Nobel Committee to the Academy. And this is also an interesting thing that in my my relatives, my siblings, my mother when she was alive, my children, for them, Nobel Prize is just a ceremony in December. My wife Victoria knows that I spent endless night during the summer with the whole kitchen table covered with books and nominations and everything, working on these reports. So that's interesting. And then we submitted around late August, we submitted the report. And then in the physics class, which is the sort of the physics section of the Academy, we have 2 meetings when we discuss the proposal from the Nobel Committee. And in the second meeting, the whole physics class takes a vote whether they support the proposal or whether there could be conflicting opinions, which they can express.
People in the class?
Yeah, in the physics class now, it's maybe usually at a meeting, maybe 30 to 35.
Okay.
It's different from the old days because now you can be elected a new member if somebody in the physics class turns 65. In the old days, one could only elect a new member when somebody died. So the class was much smaller at that time. And then in October, there is this meeting in Pleno in the academy, and you take a vote. And the decision is final and without appeal. And then the names of the laureates are announced. But first, the committee will go to a special room to make a phone call to the laureates so that they will hear directly from the committee that they had won the Nobel Prize. And this is quite a fun experience because they are totally surprised. And you can hear their, wow, I won the Nobel Prize. Yeah, and then December 10th, as I mentioned, this is the award ceremony. And what my family think I'm doing on this day. Except Victoria, of course. So let's show a few examples of Nobel Prizes, just how you can formulate it. James Chadwick discovered the neutron, and the citation here is very simple: for the discovery of the neutron. Doesn't have to be anything more. Here is an example of an invention prize, Donald Glaser, for the invention of the bubble chamber. I think one can say here also that the invention prizes are a little bit of two types. One that is a very practical use, for example, optical fibers, lead, and so on. Here is an example of an invention important for physics, but probably not so important for the general public. Here is a shared prize. Two people having the prize for groundbreaking experiments regarding the two-dimensional material graphene, Andrei Gain and Konstantin Nosolov. And here is a little bit interesting story because nobody understood how to pronounce his name. Because when I went out to the decision at the academy, I checked Wikipedia. His name was not available in Cyrillic. So we didn't really know how to pronounce his name. But very short after he had been announced winner, then came also Cyrillic, his name Cyrillic, and then one would see because it's Novosolov. In Russian, I guess.
Yeah.
Novosolov.
And finally, you can have a divided prize. Here is an example of this in 1978. You recognize Kapitsa for his basic invention and discoveries in the area of low temperature physics, and Penzias and Wilson for the discovery of cosmic microwave radiation. And here you can see an example of a divided prize where there is very little connection between the two parts. It doesn't have to be according to statutes. Each part must stand alone. But if they stand alone, then it's fine. But you cannot give the prize to 4 people. 3 is the maximum of people. 2 is the maximum of citations. So these are the limitations. Now we go to Bogolyubov. I wrote here when he lived, because I will make a comparison later on. He was first nominated in 1959 by a physicist by the name of Robert Rompe in Berlin. But I read about him, I didn't know him before, but apparently he spent a lot of time in St. Petersburg also, so he was sort of speaking Russian. In 1960, there were 2 nominations from Soviet Union, Bogolyubov and Ambarsumyan. I don't know them either, maybe you know their names, but they nominated. And it would take, as I will show you in white, 11 years before Bogolyubov was once again nominated from Soviet Union. And this was the laureate from 1964, Basel. Here's an interesting nomination. He was nominated together with Landau from Poland. I wonder how that would have worked out with a shared prize between Landau and Bogolyubov. One can discuss that. Here is John Berlin, and as you can see, He lived almost exactly the same time as Bogolyubov. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1956 for the transistor. So I'm not going to talk about that, but now it's only for his theory of superconductivity. First nomination came already in 1961, and then BCS was kept together. I'm coming to the two others in a short while. There was a special report by Oskar Klein, who was member of the Nobel Committee at the time. He was, I would say, clearly the most outstanding theoretical physicist in Sweden of his generation. And he wrote a special report about Bardeen, and Oskar Klein was usually quite cautious when he wrote his first special report. So he said, it's too early, we have to wait and see. The two others in the BCS was Leon Cooper and Robert Schrieffer. And the dates here are interesting because Cooper passed away in 2024. And I mentioned the 50-year rule, but if a laureate is still alive, you cannot disclose the archive. It has to be closed until no laureate from that time is still alive. So Cooper passed away in 2024, which means that this seminar is the first where the archive is disclosed. Another interesting thing is when they were born, just before leaving office on Friday, I ran into a colleague of mine. We served on the Nobel Committee for several years together. And so we started to talk, and I said that, well, I'm going to Kiev to talk about this Nobel Prize. And I said, you know, Cooper passed away just 1.5 years ago. I think he was the youngest, I said. No, I think Schrieffer was the youngest. So when I came home, I got curious, and you can see it's very close. So I wrote a message to him, you know, it was a photo finish between the two of them. In 1963, Herr Fröhlich, I'm not going to talk more about him, but he obtained 5 nominations. He was sort of earlier than Bardeen BCS. He published already in 1950 first attempts to try to address superconductivity.
He visited 3 times our institute.
Oh, he did?
Yes.
I didn't know that. Very interesting. And of course, there were also nomination of Bardeen. In 1966, a special report was written by Hans Åström. You can see it standing here. These are the KTH physics professor at the Royal Institute of Technology in 1980. Here's my supervisor, Peter Ehrman. None of them are still alive today. His special report was very cautious. Yes?
Thank you. Is this Armstrong how you write the unit, 1 Armstrong?
Yes, it is. It's the same letter. It is, yes. But so the pronunciation is Ångström. But of course, people forget about this and the dots. And
Thank you.
actually, the name Ångström is a taken name. Previous generation of Ångström was, I think it was his grandfather or something. His name is Persson, but he wanted to have a more original name. So he took a name from his village, Ånge, and it became Ångström. Without this, we would have the unit Persson instead of Ångström. Anyhow, Nobel Committee was not impressed by this special report. Here is a nomination of Bogolyubov from Gleb Vasilievich Vatagin. Vatagin, yes. And I understand that he was in Ukraine, or Soviet Union at least.
USSR.
So this was the nomination in 1967. And of course, what he highlighted was superfluidity and superconductivity. Here I mentioned something from Peter Higgs. We have, after Oskar Klein, we have something called the Klein Lecture in Stockholm. And in 2009, Peter Higgs was invited to give the Klein Lecture. And Peter Higgs was no fan of fancy PowerPoint presentation. As you can see, this is overhead. We probably had to run around and try to find the overhead machine at the time. But it's interesting because he's making a list here of spontaneous symmetry breaking. And the first one is ferromagnetism by Heisenberg, but the second one is superfluidity by Bogolyubov in 1947. And then comes an interesting thing here. This is the paper in 1950. This paper by, here it says, Landau and Ginzburg. So now I'm coming to a little detour. If you go to the collected works of Landau, you look up this translation of this paper. It is written here in Cyrillic, but as you can very easily see, it is written by somebody who doesn't master the Cyrillic alphabet. You see the order, it's Landau and Ginzburg. But you see the first letter here, B. Of course, it's Vitali Ginzburg. So this paper is referred to either as Landau Ginzburg. And the reason I noticed this was that when Peter Higgs gave this lecture, he stopped here and said, you know, I gave this talk once, and somebody came up to me and said, if Ginzburg would hear this, he would be very upset. And so I got curious about this. And of course, as you see, this is not correct. The person doesn't understand Cyrillic, and I think there is also some misspelling here with superconductivity. So I decided to look up the original paper, which is not available, at least not, I have not been able to find it online. But I had consulted a friend in St. Petersburg who went to the library and made a copy. And as you can see, the correct order is here, Ginzburg, Landau. Well, I think Ginzburg finally could be happy because he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2003, basically based on this paper with order parameters and so on. Of course, Landau was much earlier, 1962, and I went through the archive for the nominations and special reporters of Landau, and this paper from 1950 is not mentioned. So, interesting. So let's go back to the prize of 1972. Here is the very first nomination that Ginzburg did. As you can see from the Physical Institute, and for Ginzburg, it was very clear that he nominated BCS, not Bogolyubov. Now I'm coming to the most important person in the process of finally awarding BCS. And this is Stig Lundqvist. And you may think that I found a Floyd photo, but I wanted to have a picture of Stig Lundqvist. And I searched the internet, and this was the only one I found. And this is a Ploy photo, of course, because in this Cosmos, this is the yearbook of the Swedish Physical Society. And in this booklet, there is an article by Stig Lundqvist and Tord Claesson about superfluidity and superconductivity, macroscopic quantum physics. So what they did here was to make Ploy that Stig Lundqvist, who is here, you should now try to penetrate the wall by using the tunnel effect. And Tord Claesson is the observer, he's going to observe. And the reason I wanted to keep this was because just before leaving Sweden, I got an email from Tord Claesson. He's one of the oldest active members of our physics class. And he wrote me on a totally unrelated issue. So I wrote him back, well, I'm heading for Kiev tomorrow morning, and then talking about his Nobel Prize. And then he told me that Stig Lundqvist was very much engaged in this prize, and he spent a lot of time on it. So that's why I wanted to keep this picture. But it's interesting to me. Stig Lundqvist was a very influential physicist, and the only photo one can find on the internet is this. Let me go back to him. I mean, he was, I should say that Erik knows him, because they were at the same department. in Göteborg. So he lived until 2000. He was professor of condensed matter physics at Chalmers. He was elected member of the Academy in 1973, but already in 1971, he became a joint member of the Nobel Committee for Physics. This is something we have always 5 permanent members, but we can have 1 or 2 adjoining members. Then he became member of the Nobel Committee for several years, and then he chaired the Nobel Committee for between 1980 and 1985. Here is the publications. In a special report, he made a very careful, going through all the papers by BCS and Bogolyubov. Stig Lundqvist did in this special report. He collected the 5 papers, the 5 most important papers, and then he made a very careful listing of when they were submitted to the journal. And the committee would then later on argue that BCS was a little bit ahead of Bogolyubov. But to my mind, the difference was so small, so I don't think that should be a decisive argument, actually. But let's go on. Here's now a special report by Lundqvist. It was written in Swedish, but here is my translation. His, Bogolyubov's 1958 published work must be...
Okay, so we can continue. Please, Professor LARSSON, continue.
So I'm coming back now to a special report by Stig Lundqvist in 1968. And what he's saying about Bogolyubov's 1958 published work must in the first place be regarded as an alternative formulation of the earlier published BCS theory, and must therefore step back for the groundbreaking work of Bardeen, Cooper, and Schrieffer. So you can sense that Stig Lundqvist had already at this time made up his mind, what he considered to be he didn't want to break up this trio, he wanted to keep them together. But he also says, as a theoretical physicist, Bogolyubov is far superior to his American colleagues. So now he's writing nice. He mentioned the work with that disorder, Landau Ginzburg. And the Nobel Committee at this time agreed with Lundqvist, but regarded the prize too early, so they wanted to wait. A complementary special report by Lundqvist in 1970. At that time, Bogolyubov had 2 nominations, BCS 6 nominations. He wrote complimentary and about BCS and very short about Bogolyubov. Nobel Committee now agrees with Lundqvist about the BCS, but too early. Now comes another person into the play. It's Bengt Nagel in 1971. He was at the time, I would say, the leading mathematical physicist in Sweden, and he nominated only Bogolyubov. And he knew, of course, better than almost anyone else what he had done. So he is here talking about the Bogolyubov transformation, how it was important for superconductivity, superfluidity, but also how it became very important for nuclear physics, and also his contribution to quantum field theory. So Bengt Nagel, and I will show you next slide about him. He lived from 1927 to 2016. He was a professor at KTH and leading mathematical physicist in Sweden. He was in 1978 elected member of the Academy, but already in 1964 until 1988, he was a secretary of the Nobel Committee for Physics. And in the last 11 years, he was also a member. So you can see he's not anybody. He was a person who did very serious work for the Nobel Prize. And unfortunately, his special reports are too young to be quoted. But I've read many of them, and they are extremely careful. He devoted so much time to the Nobel Prize. And it's interesting because he and Stig Lundqvist served on the same committee for several years. I don't know to what extent they discussed the 1972 prize, but I will assume they didn't, because once you have finished the prize the next year, I mean, that's history. You don't go back. And I learned from a much older colleague than I the following: you don't correct an erroneous Nobel Prize with a Nobel Prize. So once superconductivity had been awarded, then that's it. You don't come back and say, okay, we should have included Bogolyubov now. That won't happen. So let's look at the situation in 1971. Bogolyubov had now 9 nominations, 1 from Basov, and it's always, I would say, weighted a little bit more if you have a nomination by a Nobel laureate. That sort of gives more weight to the nomination. BCS, 6 nominations. Stig Lundqvist, now a joint member of the Nobel Committee. He was very well aware of Bengt Nagel's very insightful nomination, and understood that he had to write more serious report about Bogolyubov. So now Stig Lundqvist had to sit down and really trying to understand what Bogolyubov had done. And this is when the Nobel Committee referred to this timeline I showed you, with BCS publishing slightly ahead of Bogolyubov, and concluded that the priority was in clear favor of BCS. And here I disagree. I mean, the important point was to what extent was Bogolyubov independent of BCS. That's the important thing. Then, I mean, who cares about 6 months? It's not decisive. I mean, but that's how it went. Now we come to the grand finale in 1972. Now Bogolyubov had 12 nominations. Once again by Basov, Nagel, and a number of other people. BCS, 8 nominations, one of them Ginsburg. Nobel Committee wrote the report. The committee has come to the conclusion that the creation of BCS theory is an achievement of such brilliance and profound significance that the Nobel Prize is justified. And here is the final page of the report to the Academy. It is dated September 8, 1972. And here you have the 5 regular members of the committee, and then Stig Lundqvist, the adjoint member. Of the people here, I don't think I ever met Stig Lundqvist. I met Kai Sigborn several times, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1981. His father won the Nobel Prize in 1925, Manne Sigborn. And I published a number of papers with Kai Sigborn's older son, Per Sigborn. I know him very well. Bengt Edlén, he was an atomic spectroscopist. I heard him once or twice, but I didn't really know him. The others, I don't think I ever met. So this was what went to you can see here, Bardeen, Cooper, and Schrieffer. And of course, they had here also an argument as to, is it possible to award a second prize, physics prize, to a person? And the conclusion was that there is nothing in the Nobel statutes that prevent awarding a second physics prize. I mean, there has certainly been an example of a person with 2 Nobel Prizes, most famous probably Marie Curie. She was awarded first the physics prize in 1903 and then the chemistry prize in 1911. But in physics, it's only Bardeen. Well, this was the decision, and the Academy followed this. And finally, an acknowledgement. I'm thankful for access to the Nobel archives and for access to all the letters of nomination, scientific reports, and so on. And I thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now we have some time for questions. Probably there are any. We had the opportunity to ask you during the lecture. Maybe online somebody wants to ask. Please raise the hand. So no questions. Okay, dear colleagues, yes, one question, please.
Yes.
Mats, thank you so much for very interesting, really historic talk and very symbolic for us. In your experience, what was the most difficult decision? I don't ask you for the name or for the direction, for the field, but what the most difficult situation to take the decision?
Yes,
it should be enormous pressure.
Yes, I can easily answer that question. The most, and this may come as it came as a surprise to me, actually. The most difficult was the prices to quantum mechanics in 1933. In 1930, Raman was awarded a prize for Raman effect. Of course, Raman spectroscopy, very, very useful in physics and chemistry. But it took until 1933 before the next Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded. And this was the 1932 prize to Heisenberg and the 1933 prize to Schrödinger and Dirac. And it's very difficult to understand why the Nobel Committee was so hesitant, because this is the longest peacetime gap in the history of the prize. And now, and when I first read about this, it was in 2017. Lars Brink, who was on the middle of this photo I showed in the beginning, he was organizing a conference in Singapore, celebrating 90 years of quantum mechanics, you know, from 1927 until 2017. So he told me, and he knew I was on the committee, I was interested, and I had access to the archive. So he told me, why don't you come to Singapore and give an after-dinner speech about the Nobel Prizes to Heisenberg and Schrödinger and Dirac? And I thought, this must be very easy. And when I started to look into this, I realized that they really struggled. I mean, there are, you know, reports where they write that it's impossible to find any discovery that can be attributed to Heisenberg or Schrödinger. It's very strange, but that's a fact. So that was, I would say, that was one of the most difficult. Another example, I think, also, if we go back to quantum mechanics, I'm just finishing a book on this, so that's why now I have it in my head, was Louis de Broglie. You know that he proposed that a particle like an electron could have a wave nature. And this was something he proposed in 1924 in his thesis. But there was absolutely no experimental evidence for this, nothing. It was a hypothesis that he presented, and the first reports about de Broglie was, this is all, it didn't say this is just crap, but it was close to saying that. But then came the experiments by Davison and Germer and by Thomson exactly, where they clearly show that an electron can have a wave-like nature. And this changed, of course, the situation totally. So de Broglie from...
Also got Nobel Prize.
Yes.
Shows that
Yes, yes.
electron particles.
Yes, exactly. And it's interesting because there were the three of them, Davison, Germer, and Thomson. Davison got the prize at the same time as Thomson, but Germer was left out. He had 8 nominations that year, and he was not awarded. And I still, to this day, I don't understand why. And I read the archive, and it doesn't really say. He was clearly deserving, and that was the 3rd spot. So sometimes...
Yesterday, that in the Kyiv route, the particle has great properties.
Yes.
Sophia Castillo. Okay, other questions? If any, in Zoom, probably.
Well, I should, when you ask about difficult Nobel Prizes, I mean, there is one prize that stands out, which is unique in the history. And this is the 2021 prize awarded in 1922 to Albert Einstein. It was awarded for his work on the photoelectric effect. In his diploma, it clearly says that it's not given for the theory of relativity.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very interesting story, how they realized there were opposition in the Nobel Committee against the theory of relativity. And Carl Wilhelm Osen, who was new in the committee here, he understood completely that it will be impossible to award Einstein for the theory of relativity. So he found this trick to get the Einstein the prize. And after that, nobody nominated Einstein. So nobody nominated Einstein after he got the prize. So we are standing in this rather strange situation that quantum mechanics has been very generously awarded. Theory of relativity, nothing. So,
Okay, Eric, please, your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mats, for a very nice talk. I hope you will be agreed to give it in Stockholm also, so that we can ask you more questions.
yeah, sure, I can do that.
Yeah. So I'd like to say that, Stig Lundqvist was not only in my department, he was actually my first scientific boss. And I used to meet him quite often and talk to him. But then he was kind of almost retiring and never really had an in-depth discussion about science with him. I think, could you comment on why did he go so strongly for BCS against Bogolyubov? Yeah. Was it his own personal involvement with Bardeen and with American science, or was it that he didn't quite understand what Bogolyubov did?
Well, I think to begin with, I think he had difficulties to understand Bogolyubov's ab initio approach to superconductivity. I mean, I think it's tough reading. And to my mind, I mean, the tension was between mathematical physics, Nagel, and the condensed matter theory, which was Stig Lundqvist. And exactly why he probably because it was easier to compare BCS theory with experiments. It was probably more difficult to compare experiments to Bogolyubov's theory. That's what I think. And I think Tord Claesson told me in an email just before coming here that Stig Lundqvist had to work hard to persuade the rest of the Nobel Committee that BCS agreed well with experiments. So that was probably the reason. I don't think it was any personal connection, not that I know, but maybe you know, Erika, I don't know.
No, I just remember some remark that I think by Stig Lundqvist that when he got the first Nobel Prize, I mean,
But
Bardeen.
I don't think that made a difference.
Yeah, when he got the first Nobel Prize by Bardeen, he was not at the dinner. He didn't talk to anybody because he was doing the calculation on the side by his, he had a paper out to do the calculation for the next Nobel Prize. That is according to Stig Lundqvist. True or false, I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah.